Step out of the vehicle right now, or I will remove you myself. Those were the first words Officer Karen Ellis hurled toward the man she had not even allowed to finish a sentence. Her voice cut through the cold January air with a force that startled the families walking nearby. It was not a request. It was a threat delivered without hesitation, without pause, and without any attempt to understand who she was speaking to. In that single moment, before the man even had time to respond, she placed her hand on the driver's door as if possession alone gave her the right to forget her own training. The boy in the back seat froze. His father tried to stay calm, but the officer had already decided the tone of the morning, and nothing that followed would soften it. Before going into this story, tell me where you are watching from, subscribe to the channel, and give me a like. Your support helps these stories reach more people who care about justice and accountability. On that bitterly cold Saturday morning, Dr. Elijah Malcolm Thompson woke with the simple, ordinary rhythm of a father preparing his son for another piano lesson. He moved with the calm of a man who understood structure, responsibility, and the fragile habits that make a family feel safe. He kissed his wife, pulled on his coat, and gently tightened the straps on Noah's booster seat. Noah talked about the new piece he wanted to show his teacher. His small voice carried a hopeful brightness, the kind only an 8-year-old can create on a winter morning. Elijah listened with a quiet pride. He treasured these minutes. He enjoyed the drive along the lake with his son. He enjoyed the steadiness of the routine. Even the cold felt familiar. The sunlight bounced off the snow in sharp, clean flashes, and for a moment the world seemed peaceful. He started the engine of the dark blue Volvo and pulled onto Lakeshore Drive. Noah hummed the opening measures of his lesson. Elijah glanced in the mirror, smiling at the boy's focus. He always said music helped Noah think. It helped Elijah think, too. For a man who lived in case law, constitutional texts, and the weight of teaching young students how to defend the rights of others. The purity of his son's piano notes offered a gentle kind of clarity. He drove south with steady hands, feeling the warmth of the heater rise through the cabin, grateful for the quiet space they shared. A few miles away, Officer Karen Ellis sat alone in her patrol car, fighting the exhaustion that comes only when the night before never really ended. She had argued with her soon-to-be ex-husband until her voice cracked. She had slept less than an hour. The caffeine she poured into her body was doing little to steady her nerves. Her eyes were raw, her patience thin, her judgment clouded. Yet she had accepted an overtime shift, convincing herself she could manage one more morning on the road. She told herself she was fine, but the truth was simple. She was in no condition to police anyone. She was angry, bruised by her own life, and desperate for something she could control. When she saw the Volvo, she focused not on the flow of traffic, nor the early joggers, nor the families pushing strollers along the lakefront. She saw a dim taillight in bright sunlight and convinced herself it was enough. She flicked on her lights with a quick burst of irritation. She did not consider the time of day, the neighborhood, or the mild inconvenience of the minor equipment issue. Instead, she heard a voice in her own head telling her that she needed to take action, that someone needed to be corrected, that someone needed to listen to her for once. Elijah noticed the lights behind him and eased the car onto the side of the road. He was calm. He reached for his wallet, checked on Noah, and waited with the quiet expectation that this would be brief. He had been stopped before. He had lectured on the Fourth Amendment. He knew the rules. He knew how these moments should unfold, and he trusted the law to protect him. He breathed slowly as Noah looked up with wide, curious eyes, asking in a soft whisper, "Are we in trouble? Daddy?" Elijah reassured him with a gentle smile, telling him everything was fine, But before Elijah could speak, before he could even greet the officer, Karen walked up with a rigid posture that revealed the tension simmering inside her. She did not ask for registration. She did not ask for a license. She did not acknowledge Elijah as the driver. She demanded identification as though she were confronting a threat. Her tone carried an accusation Elijah had not earned. He answered calmly, explaining his rights, citing the very cases he taught his students every semester: Hebo, Maryland v. Wilson, the boundaries of lawful demands during a traffic stop. But she did not want explanations. She wanted obedience without question. Noah watched from the back seat with rising fear. He sensed something was wrong. The officer's voice felt harsh, colder than the air outside. Elijah felt the tension too, but he worked to keep his tone measured, steady, and respectful. He knew escalation often began in small moments, and he did not want his son to witness anything painful. But the officer's impatience grew. Her breathing quickened. Her anger tightened. She reached for the door without warning and pulled it open with a force that startled Elijah. His hand shot up in instinctive surprise. She shouted again. He tried to comply, but her grip found his coat before he could steady his footing. She shoved him toward the pavement with a pressure far stronger than the situation warranted. His knee struck the salted ground. The sharp pain shot through him. The sound of Noah's scream followed moments later. Joggers slowed their pace. Families paused. Phones came up. A law student named Jamal Harris, out for a morning run, stopped immediately when he recognized the danger unfolding. His phone was already mounted on his chest. The red recording light blinked in perfect clarity. He watched the officer pull Elijah's hands behind his back, tighten the cuffs, and ignore the terrified cries of the child in the back seat. Jamal knew he was capturing something that would matter. He did not know how much. Not yet. Elijah tried to speak, but his words were cut short by the cold steel locking around his wrists. He looked toward his son, saw the fear in his eyes, and felt something inside him break. He had spent his life teaching others the meaning of rights, the weight of justice, the importance of restraint. Yet here he was, on a silent stretch of Lakeshore Drive, held down by someone who had no interest in any of those values. The morning had started like any other, but it would not end that way. Not for him, not for Noah, not for Chicago. At 9:22 a.m., the moment the handcuffs clicked, the world around them seemed to stop breathing. The officer's grip tightened with a force that felt more personal than procedural, more driven by her own unrest than any risk posed by the man kneeling before her. Elijah stayed still, not because he was helpless, but because he saw his son's face pressed against the back window, eyes shaking with fear. He had spent his entire career teaching restraint. Now he had to live it. He spoke with calm, asking for a moment to reassure his child. The officer ignored him. She reached for his arm with the same harshness she had shown from the first second of the stop. Her voice cut through the air again, sharp and commanding, as though raising the volume could make up for the lack of reason guiding her actions. "Do not move," she shouted, though he had moved only to keep himself balanced on the cold ground. Traffic thickened around them as weekend families slowed. Startled by the sight of a respected black man on his knees beside a car with a child crying in the back seat. Cyclists braked. Joggers pulled out their phones. Drivers cracked their windows in disbelief. This was a busy stretch of Hyde Park, but scenes like this still hit with a force that made people step instinctively toward the edge of the sidewalk. They watched an encounter that should never have escalated beyond a conversation, yet had already become an unnecessary display of coercion. Elijah's hands were pinned behind his back. His knee bled through his pants. His breath came in steady but slow waves as he worked to keep Noah calm. The officer stood above him with her jaw clenched, her posture rigid, her voice rising each time Elijah tried to speak. Noah's voice finally broke through the noise. "Please stop," he cried, the words trembling out of him. The sound startled even a few bystanders. The officer glanced toward the boy with a look that held impatience instead of concern. Elijah felt a surge of pain deeper than the sting in his knee. He tried to lift his voice, tried to sound steady so his son would not feel alone. "It's all right, Noah," he said. But the words sounded thin under the weight of the situation. Noah unbuckled himself without thinking. He pushed open the door and ran toward his father. His small hands reached for Elijah's sleeve, clinging to him with desperation. Elijah leaned slightly to reassure him, but the officer stepped forward and blocked the child with her forearm. The gesture lacked compassion. It lacked necessity. It carried only the same hollow authority she had shown all morning. Nearby, Jamal Harris saw everything from 30 feet away. His morning run had turned into a moment he knew demanded documentation. His phone, mounted to his chest strap, captured the scene in crystal-clear 4K. The audio picked up every word, every breath, every cry. He stayed perfectly still, letting the camera do the work. He knew the law. He knew his right to record. He had seen enough cases in class to recognize when someone's rights were being violated, but theory and reality were never supposed to collide like this. Not with a professor he admired, not with a child begging for mercy, not on a calm Saturday morning that should have belonged to families and routines. As Jamal recorded, another bystander began live streaming, and then another. Within minutes, dozens of phones were pointed toward the flashing lights, forming a silent circle of witnesses. They recorded because they had learned the hard lesson of modern America. If a camera did not exist, the truth often vanished. They recorded because they saw a man who did not resist being treated as though he were a threat. They recorded because they saw a child who should have been walking into a music lesson, now clinging to his father's arm while an officer treated him like an inconvenience. Some whispered in disbelief. Others simply stared. Elijah tried again to speak, hoping to diffuse the officer's rising agitation. His tone stayed calm, a trained calm, the kind used by people who know losing control will only invite deeper harm. He explained again that he was complying, that he posed no risk, that his son was frightened, but she heard none of it. "You are interfering with a lawful stop," she barked. Even though Elijah had done nothing but follow instructions, her frustration had nothing to do with safety. It had everything to do with a man who did not fold under pressure. She mistook his calm for defiance. She mistook his knowledge for challenge. She mistook his dignity for threat. When Noah tried again to reach his father, the officer stepped between them a second time. Her posture grew sharper, her movements more aggressive. Elijah's heart tightened. He knew he needed to keep Noah from becoming a target of her temper. He looked directly into his son's eyes and told him gently to stand back. But Noah could not. His fear overwhelmed him. He wrapped his arms around Elijah's legs and refused to let go. The officer reached toward him again, attempting to push him away, and a collective gasp rose from the crowd. In that moment, Sergeant Robert Diaz, several blocks away, received the 20th 911 call in 4 minutes. Multiple reports of an officer hurting a dad, pushing a child, handcuffing a man who was not resisting. Diaz had been on the job for 29 years. He had seen good policing and bad policing. He had seen misunderstandings and misconduct, but he had never seen this many calls pour in this fast with this level of distress. He understood immediately that something was wrong. He raced to his car and sped toward the scene with an urgency that pulled at his chest. But he was not on scene yet. And in the minutes before he arrived, the damage grew. The officer tightened the cuffs until Elijah winced. Noah kept crying. A woman nearby began shouting at the officer to stop. A man demanded she call a supervisor. Others pleaded for her to think about the child, but she remained fixed on her own interpretation of control. Her decisions continued to harden. Even as the crowd's alarm grew louder, Elijah kept his voice soft for Noah. He told him he would be fine. He told him to breathe. He told him to step back so he would not be harmed. Inside, he felt a deep ache that no one should feel in front of their child. He had spent years fighting for justice in classrooms, courtrooms, and public debates, yet no amount of knowledge could protect him from the simple truth unfolding in front of him. The officer did not see him. She saw only a projection of her own anger. And the more he stayed calm, the more she mistook him for someone she needed to overpower. The scene had become undeniable to everyone watching. A father on the ground. A boy trying to comfort him. An officer whose judgment had fractured long before she arrived at the stop. A line of witnesses recording with steady hands, knowing this footage would tell a story no voice alone could capture. And through it all, Elijah kept his eyes on Noah, refusing to let fear take root, even as he felt the cold metal tighten around his wrists. In the final seconds before Sergeant Diaz arrived, the officer stood over Elijah with her breath sharp and uneven. She believed she had asserted control, but the truth was already out of her hands. Every phone around her was capturing the beginning of a storm she could no longer stop. Noah's cry cut through the morning like a wound that refused to close. It was sharp. It was terrified. It carried the helpless truth that a child understands danger long before he can name it. He clung harder to his father's leg, desperate to keep him close, desperate to make the moment stop. Elijah tried to shift his balance to protect him, but the handcuffs locked behind his back made even simple movements painful. He leaned as far as he could, wishing he could shield his son from every second of what was unfolding. "It's all right," he whispered, though his voice trembled in a way Noah had never heard before. That tremble alone was enough to deepen the child's fear. Officer Karen Ellis stepped forward again, her frustration rising with each breath. Noah's presence annoyed her. His tears irritated her. She saw him not as a frightened child, but as an obstacle. Without hesitation, she extended her forearm and pushed him away from his father. The contact was not violent enough to injure him, but it was harsh enough to send a shock through everyone watching. Noah stumbled backward, his small hands reaching for Elijah as he fell onto the icy pavement. His cry broke into a raw, shaking sob that echoed down the line of cars. Elijah's heart clenched in silent agony. He tried to turn, but the cuffs bit deeper into his wrists. The officer's actions no longer looked like authority. They looked like anger without purpose. The crowd reacted immediately. A woman gasped. A man shouted for the officer to stop touching the child. Another stepped closer with his phone raised, his voice low but firm, demanding she call a supervisor. The officer ignored all of them. Her movements grew tighter. Her breath came faster. She kept repeating the same fragmented command without context or clarity. Her words no longer sounded like procedure. They sounded like someone losing control. And then, in one sudden moment that changed everything, a patrol SUV pulled up with urgency that signaled experience, not panic. Sergeant Robert Anthony Diaz stepped out before the vehicle had fully settled. His coat was half-zipped. His eyes read the scene in one sweep. He saw the child on the ground. He saw the man in cuffs. He saw the officer standing above them with the rigid posture of someone who had gone too far. But then he saw the face of the man in handcuffs. Recognition struck him faster than breath. The color drained from his face. His stomach dropped. His mind reached back to the training session 2 years earlier. The one taught by a calm, precise professor from the University of Chicago. A professor who spoke not with arrogance but with clarity. A man who had guided the department through constitutional case law with patience and respect. A man Diaz had personally thanked after the seminar. It was him. It was Dr. Elijah Malcolm Thompson, a respected scholar, a community voice, a man who had helped train them, a father with his child beside him, and he was kneeling on the pavement in handcuffs. Diaz felt a physical jolt of disbelief. He moved fast, almost stumbling as he pushed through the small crowd. "What happened here?" he demanded, his tone sharper than anyone had ever heard from him. Karen straightened, suddenly unsure. Her confidence cracked the moment his voice hit the air. She stammered something about officer safety, about non-compliance, about perceived threat. None of it made sense. None of it matched the scene before him. Diaz lifted his hand to silence her. He had no interest in excuses. He leaned down to Elijah with urgency and respect. "Professor Thompson." "Sir." "Are you hurt?" The word "sir" was not ceremonial, it was genuine. Elijah shook his head, keeping his focus on Noah, who crawled toward him again. Diaz knelt and placed a steady hand on Noah's shoulder, his voice softening. "You're safe now. I promise you that." The boy clung to him, desperate for reassurance. Diaz turned to Karen with a fury carefully held behind tight control. "Uncuff him, immediately." The command left no room for delay. Karen's hands shook. She reached into her coat for the key, but her fingers trembled so badly she fumbled it. The small metal piece slipped from her grasp and fell into the thin layer of snow near Elijah's knee. The crowd gasped again. She crouched, reached for it, dropped it a second time, her panic rising with every failed attempt. Her training had abandoned her. Her certainty had dissolved. She was finally confronting what she had done. Diaz stepped in, recovering the key himself, his lips pressed into a tight line as he worked quickly, speaking quietly to Elijah. "I am so sorry. This should never have happened." Elijah nodded, not with forgiveness, but with the quiet dignity of a man who understood the gravity of the moment better than anyone. The cuffs clicked open. Pain shot through his wrists as the circulation returned. He brought his hands forward and immediately wrapped his arm around Noah, pulling him close, whispering comfort into the boy's hair. Karen stood frozen, her face pale, her composure shattered. She looked around and saw the cameras everywhere, phones, live streams, chest-mounted recordings, the unblinking body cam on her own uniform. Every angle captured her choices. Every second was recorded. She realized then that the morning was no longer a routine stop. It had become an incident, a story, a matter of public scrutiny. Her shoulders sank under the weight of that awareness. Diaz turned to her, his voice low but firm, filled with years of command. "Step back. Do not speak. Do not touch them again." Karen obeyed with silent hesitation, her breath shaking as she took a step away from the father and child she had mishandled so badly. She wanted to defend herself, to explain, but the reality around her left no room for justification. The bystanders watched as Elijah slowly rose to his feet, holding Noah with steady arms. Their expressions carried a mix of relief and outrage. They had witnessed something they would not forget. They had watched a respected man treated like a criminal. They had seen a child pushed aside. They had seen fear used where compassion was needed. And now they saw the beginning of the reckoning. Diaz positioned himself protectively between Elijah and Karen. His voice grew even more controlled, the tone he used only in moments when the truth mattered more than procedure. "Professor Thompson," he said, "I am calling medical. I am calling the district commander. I will stay with you until they arrive. We will handle this the right way." Elijah nodded again, grateful for the calm after so much chaos. But the pain in his chest remained. He looked down at Noah, who buried his face against him, trying to make sense of what had happened. Elijah stroked the back of his son's head, wishing he could erase the memory. The crowd remained silent, waiting, recording. holding the scene with the gravity it deserved. Karen stood alone now, her world collapsing as she watched Diaz speak to Elijah with the respect she had refused to give. She knew the consequences had already begun. She knew the cameras would define everything that happened next. She knew there was no undoing what she had done. And in the middle of Lakeshore Drive, on a bitter winter morning, a simple traffic stop had become a moment Chicago would remember. A moment that started with a child's cry and ended with a sergeant's horror. By 10 a.m., the quiet stretch of Lakeshore Drive had already become the epicenter of something far larger than a single traffic stop. It happened faster than anyone could process. Jamal's 4K recording uploaded itself the moment his phone connected to steady signal. Within seconds it spread, first to a friend, then to a group chat, then to a neighbor, then to thousands. Every new share added another wave of disbelief, another voice asking how this could happen, another viewer pausing in stunned silence as the footage replayed the moment the officer shoved a child aside and forced his father to the ground. The video hit social media with the force of a spark dropped into dry grass. It caught instantly. It spread without resistance. It lit the city in a way no one could undo. Hashtags formed within minutes. The strongest rose above the rest. One phrase captured the raw emotion of the moment. Daddy in handcuffs. It echoed across platforms. It surged across timelines. It became both a cry of outrage and a shield of solidarity. Parents saw it first. Mothers felt it in their chest. Fathers felt it in their throat. The image of an 8-year-old boy watching his father be handcuffed beside a family car struck at the most human part of people. It hit without warning. It demanded attention. Within 30 minutes, the hashtag climbed past local news. Within 40, it reached national trending lists. At the Hyde Park Children's Music School, parents waiting in the lobby saw the video appear on their phones. At first, they watched with confusion, then with growing shock, and then with the unmistakable clarity that something terrible had happened only blocks away. They recognized the car. Some recognized the boy. Some recognized the father. A piano teacher dropped her sheet music when she saw the clip. A mother pressed her hand to her mouth and whispered, "That's Noah." Chairs scraped across the floor as parents rushed out, calling family, trying to understand what they had just seen. They left coffee cups behind. They left jackets unzipped. They moved with the urgency of parents protecting a child who was not even theirs. Local stations picked up the story next. Helicopter crews were already in the air for weekend coverage when the first newsroom received multiple tagged videos. They pivoted instantly. Within minutes, cameras pointed toward Lakeshore Drive. The live feed showed squad cars, bystanders, and a sergeant kneeling beside a frightened boy who clung to his father's arm. There were no dramatic edits, no music, just the truth, captured in full daylight, at the scene. Elijah held Noah close as paramedics examined the scrape on his knee. The pain in his leg was manageable. The pain in his heart was not. Noah's face stayed pressed against his coat, his small body tense and trembling, unable to release the fear. Elijah lifted him into his arms with a steadiness he did not feel inside. He felt the eyes of the crowd, the distant hum of news helicopters, the gravity of the moment settling on him like weight he had not asked to carry. Yet he carried it anyway, because his primary duty in that moment was clear. Protect his son, calm his son, walk his son away from the place where innocence had been pierced. Sergeant Diaz stayed by his side until the last moment. His voice remained low and respectful. He offered a ride to the district station to file a report. He offered medical help. He offered to call a supervisor to meet Elijah at home, but Elijah refused gently. He needed to take Noah away from the flashing lights and the watching eyes. He needed to let his son breathe again. So he thanked Diaz, nodded once with quiet dignity, and walked toward the car with Noah in his arms. The officer who had caused it all stood several yards away, flanked by 2 responding units. Karen Ellis had been separated from the scene the moment higher-ranking officers arrived. She stood stiff, her hands behind her back, her breaths shallow. She had already been ordered to return to the district. Not for a break, not for rest, for accountability, for review, for the process she had forced into motion by losing control when it mattered most. Officers who had once greeted her with casual conversation refused to look at her. Some shook their heads. Some stepped around her without acknowledging her presence. She had become a symbol of everything the department feared in its own ranks, a choice made in haste, under strain, without judgment, creating harm that could not be undone. One officer escorted her to a cruiser. She stepped inside without protest, her face pale, the door shut with a heavy finality. Her morning had collapsed, and her career had already begun to fracture as the cruiser pulled away. The crowd remained silent, watching the man and his child walk down the sidewalk. Elijah held Noah with both arms, feeling the boy's fingers dig into his coat. Noah said nothing. His silence was heavy. It carried fear, confusion, and the first fragile thread of distrust in the world around him. Elijah understood the weight of that silence. It broke something inside him to hear it. He kept walking, counting each step, breathing slowly so his son could feel the steady rhythm of his father's heartbeat. At home. The quiet was deep. Elijah set Noah on the couch and knelt to look him in the eye. Noah's cheeks were streaked with dried tears. His breathing was uneven. Elijah spoke gently, using the soft, measured tone he used when guiding his students through difficult truths. He told Noah he was safe. He told him the officer had been wrong. He told him none of what happened was his fault. He told him his father was here, and always would be. Noah nodded, but the fear in his eyes did not disappear. Elijah wrapped him in his arms, holding him with the strength of a man who knew his child had just crossed a line no child should ever see. Outside. Chicago moved with rising tension. People watched the footage again and again. Some paused mid-meal. Some called friends. Some called their city council representatives. Some called reporters. The mayor's office received its first inquiry within an hour. The Civilian Office of Police Accountability requested the footage. The superintendent issued an internal directive. And the community, already familiar with stories like this, pressed harder, because this time a child had been pushed aside. This time a law professor had been thrown to the ground. This time it had happened in broad daylight with dozens of witnesses. By noon, the number of views surpassed 1 million. By 1 o'clock, national networks requested statements. But at the center of the storm was a father sitting quietly beside his son, trying to steady the world inside their living room. Elijah placed a blanket around Noah's shoulders, poured him warm tea, and held his hand as the boy's breathing finally began to slow. He said nothing about the cameras, nothing about the outrage, nothing about the city watching. He focused on the child beside him, because that was the only truth that mattered in that moment. Meanwhile, at the 1st District Station, Karen sat alone in a small interview room. Officers walked past the door without stopping. No one spoke to her. No one offered comfort. No one sympathized. She felt the cold pressure of her own choices closing in. She understood, slowly and painfully, that the path she had taken that morning had already led to a place she could not escape. Her career hung by a thread, her reputation had collapsed, and the footage, now everywhere, would define her far more than any commendation she had ever earned. Chicago had ignited, and the morning that began with a father and son driving to piano lessons had become a story the entire nation was now watching. By 2 p.m. that same afternoon, The city had barely begun to absorb the shock when the first decisive strike arrived. Attorney Lisa Mae Chen stepped into the federal courthouse with a precision shaped by years of civil rights battles. She did not hesitate. She did not wait for permission. She filed an emergency federal lawsuit that named the city of Chicago, the Chicago Police Department, and Officer Karen Elizabeth Ellis as defendants. The complaint was direct and unwavering. It documented unlawful detention, excessive force, violation of constitutional protections, and emotional harm inflicted on an 8-year-old child. Lisa's words cut through the legal language with a clarity that left no room for doubt. She had represented grieving families, injured citizens, and victims of misconduct. But something about this case carried a deeper weight. A child had begged for his father. A professor had been thrown to the ground, and the truth had been recorded from every angle. The evidence moved quickly because the city feared the pace of public outrage. Body camera footage was pulled within hours. Civilian videos were collected from the internet as they spread faster than investigators could catalog them. By late evening, a team of analysts began the meticulous process of syncing every available recording. They aligned sound with sound, frame with frame, moment with moment. They matched the officer's commands, the father's calm responses, the child's cries, the bystanders' reactions, and the final confrontation when Sergeant Diaz arrived. The combined footage created a single, undeniable timeline. It revealed escalating judgment errors, unwarranted force, unnecessary commands, and a moment when a child was pushed aside by an officer who should have been protecting him. The synced footage became the most powerful exhibit of the case. No narration was required, no interpretation was needed. The video spoke its own truth. 72 hours later, the city council chamber overflowed with residents, reporters, lawyers, activists, clergy, and parents who had seen the video and could not stay silent. The hearing was called to determine immediate disciplinary action and to address the overwhelming public demand for accountability. The room carried the heavy air of civic reckoning. Every seat was taken, people lined the walls. Some held printed stills from the video. Others clutched their phones with the clip ready to show again. The council members sat with stern faces, aware that the world was watching. At the center table sat Lisa, calm and composed, beside Elijah and his family. Elijah entered the chamber with the quiet dignity that had defined him throughout his career. His wife held his hand. Their son walked between them. Noah stayed close, fingers intertwined with his mother's, his small frame leaning gently against her side. The cameras in the room captured every step, but Elijah ignored them. He looked only at his son. He took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and waited for his name to be called. His wife placed a reassuring hand on his arm. Noah's grip tightened on her fingers. The family sat as one. When Elijah spoke, the room fell silent. His voice held no anger, only clarity. He described the morning exactly as it happened. He recounted the officer's tone, her misplaced suspicion, the sudden escalation, and the moment he was forced to the ground. He explained that he complied with every instruction. He explained the fear in his son's voice. He explained the helplessness of knowing the law could not shield him in those painful minutes. He paused only once. It came when he described Noah running toward him. His voice shook slightly, but he continued. "My son," he said, "should never have had to see his father treated like that." The chamber felt the weight of those words. Many lowered their eyes. Some wiped tears. Noah leaned into his mother, his face partly hidden, unsure whether to look at the screen or the floor. Then came the moment no one in the room forgot. The synced video began to play across 3 large monitors. The opening seconds showed the officer's approach, the tone, the commands, the unnecessary force, the sudden shove, the moment when Elijah hit the pavement, the small form of Noah scrambling for the door. The officer pushing him aside, the boy falling, the crowd gasping, the sergeant rushing in, the unfolding horror captured in perfect clarity. There was no room for interpretation. There was only truth. And that truth filled the chamber like a rising tide. Karen Ellis sat at the witness table across from the counsel, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles whitened. She had been ordered to attend. Her union representative sat beside her, stiff and expressionless. When the video reached the moment, she shoved Noah. The room reacted as one, a sharp, collective exhale. Some people whispered no under their breath. Others covered their mouths in disbelief. Karen's eyes widened. Her breath quickened. The sound of Noah crying, captured from multiple angles, filled the chamber with a rawness that pierced through every wall of defense she had built around herself. The chairwoman asked her to respond. Karen tried to speak. At first, her voice barely formed words. She said she felt threatened. She said she believed the father was non-compliant. She said she acted according to training. But the words collapsed the moment they left her mouth, because the video contradicted every explanation. She looked at the footage again. She saw the father kneeling, hands visible, speaking calmly. She saw the boy reaching for him. She saw her own arm pushing the child away. She saw the crowd's horror. She saw her own face, tense and rigid, unrecognizable even to herself. The truth forced its way through her defenses. Her voice cracked, then broke. Karen covered her eyes with her hands. A full, uncontrolled sob escaped her. The union representative tried to steady her, but she shook uncontrollably. She apologized in fragments. She apologized for the shove. She apologized for the escalation. She apologized for the fear she caused the boy. She apologized for failing to exercise judgment. Her breakdown did not soften the public's anger. It merely confirmed the depth of her errors. The room remained silent, not out of sympathy, out of shock. Lisa stood when it was her turn. Her voice was steady, measured, and exact. She listed each violation, each improper command, each breach of protocol. She cited the constitutional protections violated. She cited Supreme Court cases. She cited departmental guidelines. And with every reference, she anchored the narrative back to the one unchanging fact. An 8-year-old boy had watched his father be thrown to the ground for no lawful reason at the end of her presentation. She looked at the counsel and said, "This case is not about anger. It is about truth, and the truth is undeniable." Her words settled over the room with finality. When the hearing ended, the crowd rose slowly, absorbing the gravity of what they had witnessed. Some approached Elijah with quiet respect. Some touched Noah's shoulder gently. Some shook Lisa's hand. But the feeling in the room was larger than individual gestures. It felt like the beginning of a shift, a reckoning that had been coming for a long time. And in that chamber, under the pressure of evidence and truth, the city realized it could not turn away. The legal reckoning had begun. The investigation that followed moved with a speed Chicago had rarely seen. Within hours of the city council hearing, the Office of Professional Standards assembled a special review team to examine every second of the synced footage. They worked day and night. They interviewed witnesses. They reviewed the dispatch logs. They analyzed the officer's past performance. They tracked the pattern of her decisions in the moments leading up to the stop. For 9 days. The department moved with a clarity driven not by politics, but by the unshakable evidence before them. No one could soften what had happened. No one could reframe it. The facts lived on every screen, and they demanded action. On the morning of the 9th day, the department made its decision. It came in a brief, solemn announcement. Officer Karen Elizabeth Ellis was terminated, effective immediately. It was the fastest firing in the history of the Chicago Police Department. The statement acknowledged clear violations of policy, excessive force, improper escalation, and conduct unbecoming of an officer sworn to protect. It acknowledged the harm inflicted on a father and his young son. It acknowledged the erosion of trust caused by her actions. And while the department refrained from commentary beyond the written decision, the message resonated across the city. Accountability had arrived, and it had arrived quickly. But the consequences did not end with her dismissal. The state's attorney's office reviewed the footage and filed criminal charges within a week. Official misconduct, battery, endangerment of a minor, charges that carried weight, even if they did not carry the severity some demanded. Karen arrived at the courthouse with her attorney, her posture small and fragile, a shell of the officer who once walked with confidence through neighborhood streets. She listened as the charges were read, her eyes lowered, her hands trembling. She entered a plea to lesser counts under an agreement that spared her jail but did not spare her accountability. The judge accepted the plea, recognizing the harm, the public nature of the incident, and the need for structured consequences that addressed both punishment and rehabilitation. Her sentence was firm. 24 months of probation, 700 hours of community service, mandatory bias training, mandatory counseling, mandatory participation in restorative justice sessions. The judge's words struck clearly when he addressed her directly. Authority, he said, is not a shield for anger. It is a responsibility that demands restraint. Karen nodded, unable to lift her eyes. She understood the truth in his words. But understanding came too late to change what she had done. The civil side moved with equal speed, faced with overwhelming evidence. The city entered settlement discussions with Lisa Mae Chen. The negotiations were brief. The facts were unassailable. The harm was undeniable. The trauma inflicted on an 8-year-old child, recorded and witnessed by millions, required acknowledgement far beyond a simple apology. And so the city agreed to a settlement of $925,000. It was a number that reflected the gravity of the incident and the need to send a message that the city valued accountability. When the news of the settlement became public, most residents agreed it was appropriate, though some argued it was not enough. But Elijah did not seek a number for victory. He sought acknowledgement, validation, a path forward for his son. And in that regard, the settlement gave him what the law could offer. As for Karen, the personal fallout moved even faster than the legal one. Her ex-husband filed an emergency motion to modify their custody arrangement. He cited the video. He cited the charges. He cited the emotional instability displayed on camera. The judge granted the motion. Karen lost her weekend custody. The decision struck her harder than any disciplinary action. She cried in the hallway outside the courtroom, her hands covering her face, her body shaking with a grief she had not expected. Her mother stood with her, offering a trembling hand. The moment revealed a truth Karen had never imagined would become her own. The consequences were not abstract. They touched her life. They touched her child. They touched the future she had once believed was stable, unable to manage rent and legal fees. Karen packed her belongings into cardboard boxes and moved back into her mother's small house in the suburbs. It was a quiet move. No neighbors came to help. No fellow officers stopped by. Her phone barely rang. People read the news. People watched the video. People formed opinions. And those opinions shaped her days. Her world shrank in ways she never anticipated. The uniform she once wore with pride now sat folded in a box she could not bring herself to open. Meanwhile, life inside Elijah's home changed in quieter but no less profound ways. Noah still woke at night, startled by memories that arrived with unwelcome clarity. Elijah sat beside him during those nights, offering calm words and gentle hands, ensuring his son knew he was safe. The family met with a child counselor who specialized in traumatic encounters. The sessions helped, but healing moved slowly. Elijah remained patient. He understood trauma not as something to erase, but as something to guide carefully toward light. At the law school, colleagues greeted Elijah with respect tinged with sorrow. Students listened more intently when he lectured about constitutional protections. They looked at him not only as a scholar, but as a living example of the very principles he taught. His voice carried a new weight, a new resonance. He spoke not only of doctrine, but of lived truth. His dignity deepened in the eyes of those who knew him. He did not seek sympathy. He sought understanding. He offered clarity to others because offering it helped him move forward. The public conversation in Chicago shifted as well. Community meetings filled with voices demanding systemic reform. Parents spoke of fear. Teachers spoke of trust. Clergy spoke of compassion. And through it all, the image of Noah reaching for his father became a symbol that anchored every discussion. The city did not ignore it. It could not ignore it. As the weeks passed, the legal processes slowed, but the emotional consequences remained sharp. Karen continued her community service, wearing an orange vest as she swept sidewalks and parks. She spoke little. She kept her head down. She completed each hour with quiet resignation. Aware that cameras sometimes followed her from a distance, she did not hide from them. She did not complain. She simply worked, carrying the knowledge that the uniform she once wore had been replaced by tasks meant to remind her of the weight of her choices. And Elijah, ever steady, continued to hold his family close. He knew justice had moved swiftly. He knew accountability had been served. But he also knew that the most profound consequence of that day was not legal. It was personal. It lived in the quiet moments when his son leaned against him, seeking reassurance. It lived in the deeper understanding he now carried of the fragility of dignity. It lived in the responsibility he felt to protect not only his family but families across the city. Consequences had arrived in the light of day, and their truth carried through every life touched by that winter morning. In the months that followed, the city settled into a different rhythm. The outrage had not disappeared, but it had reshaped itself into purpose. Conversations grew deeper, community meetings grew larger, and through that shift, Elijah found himself standing at the center of something he had never intended to lead. He carried the weight of the experience with a quiet steadiness, refusing to let bitterness guide his steps. Instead, he chose a path that honored his son's fear, his family's pain, and the truth that millions had witnessed. With the support of the University of Chicago Law School, he founded the Noah's Shield Fund, a program dedicated to providing legal support for children and families traumatized by police encounters. The mission was simple: protect those who felt powerless, defend those who did not know where to turn, give children a voice in moments when the world grew too large and too frightening. The fund grew quickly, driven by donations from across the country, driven by parents who saw their own children in the image of an 8-year-old boy crying for his father. Jamal Harris became one of the fund's first ambassadors. His video had changed the course of the case, but now his voice carried a different strength. He spoke to law students. He spoke to high schoolers. He spoke to neighborhood groups. He spoke with precision, with calm conviction, and with a clear sense of responsibility. His face appeared on national news programs. His interviews were shared by millions. He became not just a witness, but a symbol of how one person's choice to record, to stay present, to speak truth, could transform an entire city's understanding. Elijah watched him with pride, grateful that a young man had used his voice so courageously. As the year passed, the city examined its own reflection. Training protocols changed, bias courses intensified, supervisory reviews increased. New community oversight measures took shape. Nothing transformed overnight, but the early steps mattered. People saw movement, they saw acknowledgement, they saw the beginning of progress. And through it all, The image of a small boy reaching for his father stayed imprinted in public memory. The red light of the body camera became a reminder that truth, once captured, could not be ignored. 1 year after the incident. The morning air carried the same bright coldness that had defined the original day. Elijah walked with Noah through Washington Park, their breaths rising in small clouds. The winter light glowed against the path. Noah held his father's hand with a comfortable ease, no longer tense, no longer afraid of the world around him. They were on their way to a community event hosted by the law school. Elijah told Noah they would stop by the monument before heading in. The boy nodded quietly. As they turned the corner, they saw her. Karen Ellis stood a few yards away, wearing an orange community service vest. She held a broom and worked slowly, clearing debris from the walkway near the Martin Luther King Jr. monument. Her posture was subdued, her movements quiet. There was no hostility in her face, only the weight of consequences and the long shadow of her own choices. She did not notice them at first. She focused on the ground, sweeping steadily. Elijah froze for a moment, unsure what to say, unsure what the moment required. His instinct was to protect Noah from the memory, but the boy had already seen her. Noah looked at Karen with a calm expression that surprised even him. He did not step closer. He did not step back. He simply watched her for a long, silent moment. Elijah watched his son's face carefully, ready to offer comfort, ready to guide him through the moment. But something shifted in Noah's eyes. Something brave. Something clear. The boy tightened his grip on Elijah's hand, lifted his chin, and whispered, "I'm not afraid anymore." The words were soft, but they carried a power that pulled at Elijah's heart. He placed a hand gently on Noah's shoulder. Karen looked up then, startled by the presence she felt before seeing them. Her eyes widened. She stood still, broom in hand, unable to speak. She looked at Elijah with a faint, fragile sorrow. She looked at Noah with something close to remorse. She did not move toward them. She did not attempt an apology. She understood that her words could not erase what had happened. She simply lowered her eyes again and stepped aside, giving them space to pass. Elijah nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than forgiveness, and walked with Noah past her. The moment needed no more words. Noah's quiet strength spoke enough for both of them. Weeks later. The auditorium at the University of Chicago Law School filled with 400 students. It was a full house for Elijah's lecture, though no one called it a lecture anymore. They called it an address. They called it a reflection. They called it a moment they did not want to miss. The sunlight through the tall windows illuminated the room with a gentle clarity. Elijah stood at the podium, wearing a dark suit, his expression calm and grounded. Noah sat in the front row beside his mother, leaning slightly forward, listening with the focused curiosity of a child who had lived part of the story being told. Elijah began with a quiet breath. He did not speak of anger. He spoke of responsibility. He spoke of how quickly dignity can be challenged. He spoke of the need for a justice system that protects even when fear rises. He spoke of the bond between a father and a child, the pain of helplessness, the duty to reshape systems that have forgotten their purpose. And then he paused. He lifted a small remote. He pressed play. The screen behind him illuminated with a single image. The red light of the body camera. It glowed in the darkness of the screen, pulsing softly, captured in the final frame before the chaos began. The room fell silent. Students watched the small red glow with a reverence that felt almost like prayer. Elijah let the image sit there. He let it speak. He let it remind everyone that truth, once recorded, refuses to fade. Then, slowly, the red light dimmed. It faded out. The screen turned black. Elijah stepped away from the podium, leaving his final message resting on the silence that followed. The red light had gone out on the screen, but not in the hearts of the people who had witnessed what it revealed. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it moved you, please subscribe and leave a like to help it reach more people.